Julie d'Aubigny was a famous 17th century French opera singer who once took the holy vows to enter a convent just so she could have sex with a nun. She also had a habit of seducing women. An opera singer and master duelist once broke into a convent and ran away with one of the nuns, and burning down the building to cover her tracks, and regularly seduced both men and just so she could have sex with another nun. Let us not forget the greatest real-life bard of all time, and killed or injured several men humiliating songs with them while she did it. Like gonna make an Assassin's Creed game with her in it. If there's one thing all human beings have always loved, it's salacious, juicy gossip. You may have seen these memes about Julie d'Aubigny, also known as La Maupin, floating around the internet for years, and honestly it's easy to see why. She's a tremendously bombastic figure in a million ways, and was seen even more so in her own time. But if we love interesting quote-worthy stories, the 18th century French public loved it just as much, and exciting and scandalous tales of the aristocracy dominated people's imaginations as the continued rise of print media spread this gossip from the confines of letters in Versailles court whispers into the hands of regular people. Julie d'Aubigny, who made waves in the French aristocracy due to her hot temper, talents, and taste in fashion, was no exception to the rules of the industry of hearsay, resulting centuries later in her legends having overtaken the already nigh impossible to find details of her real life, as well as her real personality and feelings. By the way, when you think of Julie d'Aubigny, you may first think of this Victorian fencing outfit, a replica of which I put together for my Victorian Women in Sports video, which you should definitely check out because it's one of my personal favorites. In that one, I briefly talked about how this outfit is popularly associated with Julie d'Aubigny because of the painting Les Clémuses by French Impressionist painter Jean Béraud, but just a reminder, that painting is not Julie. It is actually a painting of Parisian fencer Margherita Sylvia. Julie lived over 200 years before this painting was made in the 1890s. She would not have been wearing this. So anyway, just clarifying that. Sorry. So there's no argument that the famous French sapphic sword-fighting opera singer was, well, famous French sapphic and an opera singer who could sword fight. But just how much of this extended wild story is really the truth, and what elements of French society and media at the time would have influenced the way that Julie's story is told? Well, unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than you'd think, but it is a hell of a ride. Come learn with me. Side note, I'll get into this at the end, but this video does contain many of my own personal opinions on what may or may not be true about the story of Julie d'Aubigny. Most of these things, well, we'll never know for sure, so it's okay to have your own opinions. If you strongly disagree with any of my takes, that's totally fine, but just know that the honest truth, as is so common with history, has been lost to time. All we can do is explore. So let's get into it. But first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For this video, I had to go through a lot of different websites for research, some of them with extremely outdated or shady security, so it was great having the peace of mind knowing that my browsing was protected by Atlas VPN, which I've loved using for over a year now. Atlas VPN encrypts your data and hides your virtual location so your device gets a new IP and DNS address. Your internet traffic gets encrypted, sent off to the VPN server, and then decrypted and shipped back off to its destination, which not only keeps you safe, but also protects your privacy and personal info from prying eyes. Plus, there's a lot more that Atlas VPN can do for you other than just protecting your privacy. You can stream at high speeds, protect an unlimited number of devices, block ads and malware, and of course, save money while online shopping or booking travel because websites can't bump up the prices based on your location. And it can help with watching your favorite shows online too. With Atlas VPN, you can bypass geo restrictions and access your favorite content from across the world by simply changing your location to the country that has the content that you want to access. Atlas VPN works on any device and comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee for all subscription purchases, so you can try it out and see if you like it. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a massive discount, and it means that you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below so that you can start exploring the internet knowing that your privacy is protected. Thank you so much to Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about Julie d'Aubigny. If you're not familiar with the entire story of Julie d'Aubigny, questionable parts and all, join me for a moment for a quick overview. I'll be mixing together a bunch of info from various sources, and then we can inspect it closer and pick it apart. She was born around 1670 to 73 to Gaston d'Aubigny and an unknown mother, and Gaston was the secretary to the Comte d'Armagnac, the master of horse to King Louis XIV. She moved to the court of Versailles around 1682, where her father had her educated fully, including boys' stuff like how to ride and sword fight. Julie therefore picked up her habit of wearing men's clothes early on and became an extremely accomplished fencer. When she was 14 years old, she apparently became Count d'Armagnac's mistress, and d'Armagnac was 49, married, and had over a dozen children, by the way. Eventually, though, she was placed with a husband, Monsieur First Name de Maupin, a tax collector who was something of a huge weenie. He and Julie didn't stay together for long since he was sent away on a job, and so Julie, now a married woman with many more freedoms, decided to live her best, most chaotic life à Paris. She ran off with a fencing master named Serran, and the two made cash by giving demonstrations in taverns and fairs and places like that, and Julie's fencing prowess plus her choice in menswear caused people to accuse her of lying about being a woman, to which she tore her shirt open to prove a point. It was after this that she joined the Marseille Opera, which she found great success in because although she had no formal training or sense of music, she was extremely beautiful and had an amazing voice. It was here that she caught the eye of a girl in the audience, and they fell in love. The girl was sent to the convent of the Visitandines in either Forcalquier or Avignon, and Julie followed her under the guise of becoming a student, but she quickly tired of convent life, and one night placed the body of a recently deceased nun on the bed, set it on fire, and escaped with her girlfriend in the chaos, supposedly killing and wounding people along the way. For months they ran and hid away, after which finally the girl was returned to her parents, and the Parlement d'Aix or the Parlement de Toulouse sentenced Julie to death by fire in absentia, calling her Sœur d'Aubigny, apparently to hide the scandalous sapphic element of the incident, which is apparently worse than setting a convent on fire. Julie continued moseying around France when she met a nobleman named Comte d'Albert who, thinking she was a man, challenged her to a duel. She beat him brutally and then nursed him to health, after which they either became very close friends or lovers, depending on who's telling the story. Julie then took some singing lessons and met a new beau, Gabriel Vincent Thevenard, who ended up getting into the Paris Opera and got Julie in with him. By this point, she was only 17 years old, and was a huge success on the stage now known as Mademoiselle de Maupin. Things were smooth sailing until a ball was held by either the king or the Duc d'Orléans, and Julie showed up in men's clothing and seduced and kissed a woman on the dance floor, causing 3 guys who were interested in the woman to challenge her to a duel. She told them to meet her outside, and beat all 3 of them, or killed them. She returned to the ball, and King Louis was like, Maupin bestie, what did I say about duels? And she was like, you said we can't have them. And Louis was like chill about it for some reason and didn't prosecute her, but she did have to fuck off to Brussels for a bit. In Brussels, apparently, she had a fling with the Elector of Bavaria, who ditched her after she stabbed herself on stage, so Julie thusly fucked off to Madrid, where she became the maid to Countess Marino. Julie hated this woman so bad, and so one day before a ball, Julie dressed the Countess's hair with radishes to embarrass her, and then fucked off back to Paris before she could get got. By this point, Julie had been pardoned by the king for the dueling and the convent arson, so she returned to the Paris Opera. Here, she got into a spat with a tenor named Duménil, who was apparently being gross and handsy with the chorus girls. Julie mugged him and stole his snuff box and pocket watch, and the next day when Duménil claimed he was accosted by 3 men, she threw the stolen goods at his feet to prove that she alone did it. Then she became obsessed with the soprano Fanchon Moreau and apparently tried to kill herself because the affections were one-sided. Then she attacked her landlord for not cooking her dinner and went back to court. And then she bit Thevenard's ear on stage and drew blood, although they, for some reason, remained best pals. She also remained immensely popular among opera audiences, which surely ticked off her many enemies in the court. Then, in 1703, she met the love of her life, the Marquis Thérèse de Florensac, who was often described as the most beautiful woman in France. Though a married woman with 2 children, La Florensac was being pestered by the Dauphin and as a result had to flee to Brussels. Sadly, though Florensac and La Maupin lived quietly and harmoniously together, it was cut tragically short when Florensac died of a fever in 1705. Julie's despair was boundless, and she apparently reconnected with the weenie husband, and then promptly entered a convent where she died miserably in 1707 at the age of 33. Kind of a hell of a lot, right? And if all of it really is true, what an incredibly colorful life. The problem is, though, we've got over 11 questionable stories here, many of which have outright false elements to them, even if they're rooted in truth, and only a couple of which I'll be interrogating in depth. When I first started hearing about Julie d'Aubigny, I was amazed, but a big part of my brain that knows what 18th century France was like with regards to its celebrities, and especially its queer or otherwise gender nonconforming ones, was more than a little suspicious. My queer history senses were tingling, you could say. So, let's unpack this, shall we? Starting with the world of France's print media and sensationalism. Well, in 17th to 18th century France, people didn't have those buck-wild tabloid magazines that you see in the checkout lane at grocery stores. What they did have were the memoirs of the aristocracy and collection books like various topic dictionaries and anecdote encyclopedias. You may look at the word dictionary or encyclopedia today and think it's a well-researched source of facts, but this could not be further from the truth in this case. This is a very interesting time in France with regards to people's connection to sexuality plus religion. Early on in the 16th century, in general, people were more attached to the church's ideas of sexuality and what was or wasn't okay. Over the course of the next 200 years, things changed drastically, and by the time that Julie was alive, she lived in an era of extremely fraught tension between the more open ideas of sexuality and the church desperately clawing back any strings of control over culture that they could. People were more open, but equally more anxious. When Julie lived, it actually wasn't unbelievable to hear about women running around in men's clothes and sword fighting, but that made it all the more tasty to gossip about, much in the same way that the new women engaging in sports and bloomers were in the late Victorian era, the Edwardian Gibson girls, or the flappers of the 20s, which we'll discuss in the next video. In the decades following Julie's death in the early 1700s, this culture would only become more extreme, something that was extremely apparent if you go look at French erotic literature of the time, which sometimes was so graphically violent and horrific, it makes a lot of today's corn look fairly tame. Sorry I have to use that stupid word. If I say the real word, YouTube will come smash this video like a bug. But anyway, a lot of French pornographic literature at the time both drew from and encouraged its male readers' desires to see women, and especially lesbian women, be essentially tortured and killed in, creative ways. And even when it didn't quite go that far, it often involved the lesbian characters in question being either punished physically or by an act of God, repenting, or being cured by a man. The immense popularity of these stories, I think, is telling on itself, and you can see echoes of this ending in the way that many writers talked about Julie's death. They say she felt remorse for her life of sin and her lust for women, and so she reunited with her husband and became a devout nun, repenting to God until she died 2 years later of unknown causes. But the writers make certain you know she died alone, unloved. Although the stories of Julie d'Aubigny are never extreme in a graphically sexual sense, in part because they're always framed as being true stories and therefore have certain limits, to readers of the time it would have still been very salacious, and as a famous woman who clearly was unwilling to abide by aristocratic gender roles, she would have been a prime target to become the subject of these stories. 18th century French readers hearing about a sapphic woman may have had mixed feelings hearing them too. Today, the idea of Julie setting a convent on fire to run off with her girlfriend sounds totally badass, and many readers back then who were struggling with their own relationships to the church may may have felt vindicated by the violence not only to the convent, but also in desecrating the corpse of a nun, as evidenced by many French writings of the era where nuns are physically brutalized or otherwise shown as villains. But this too is a nuanced topic. Many French writers, all male, who wrote stories of violence involving nuns often did so as a way to express their own personal anxieties about Sapphic women in general. They feared the convent as one of the only places where women had the power, not men. They also feared the women they loved being sent to a convent and being seduced into lesbianism by other nuns. The best example of this is The Nun by Denis Diderot, written around 1760. The protagonist, Suzanne, is forced by her mother to become a nun, after which she is tortured by the sadistic other nuns at the convent. She is later made the victim by an evil, apparently lesbian, Mother Superior. Diderot's story is a thinly veiled examination of his real-life anxiety surrounding his mistress, Sophie Valland's close relationship to her sister, Madame Legendre, and Diderot wrote numerous times of his anxieties surrounding women with power and his disbelief that women can be any smarter than children. So, readers, even long before The Nun, would have already noted the historically intertwined nature of the convent and lesbianism. Whether or not Julie truly did burn down that convent to break out her nun girlfriend, as badass as it sounds, we will never know because the original source of the story is unknown, and the style of its writing is just so in line with other fabricated celebrity tales of that era, something we'll get into with regards to this specific story here in a minute. Additionally, writings from the 17th to 18th centuries on Sapphic women very frequently were done as, well, revenge pieces. As Lillian Faderman observed in Surpassing the Love of Men, these works were usually more than erotic. They were based on actual personages, women who were, in every case, aggressive and unretiring, not at all like the conventional 18th century ideal of femininity. These women have generally tread on the author's toes by their assertiveness. They had stepped out of line and behaved in unwomanly fashion, either by attempting to outsmart a man, or by imposing themselves on male business, or simply by not extending to a man the deference he believed due to him. What better way to shame such women than to attribute them fierce sexual appetites at a time when it was not proper for women to have them? Keeping in mind the sort of person that Julie was, and the fact that very few readers of these stories would have seen her as an admirable character, and therefore that mindset would influence the author, much Sapphic literature of the era was written as thinly veiled attacks on real-life women who, in some way, annoyed or insulted the author. These women perhaps really were Sapphic and therefore may have been an easy target if they acted out too much, which I personally believe might have been the case with Julie, who undeniably was Sapphic and had a huge temper. We know that Julie made a number of enemies in her life, most of whom were influential men, any number of whom may have been interested in spreading tall tales about her in these anecdote books or in their letters and memoirs, a few of which we'll get to in a minute. It's no coincidence that all the most extreme stories about Julie were published not during her short lifetime, but in the years following her death, when she was no longer around to defend herself or sue for libel. This type of writing wasn't just used as an attack on aristocratic women with little power. It's very telling that gossip of aggressive lesbianism was used later by the male revolutionaries of the French Revolution, who passed out political pamphlets claiming that Marie Antoinette was a bisexual predator who engaged in innumerable debauched liaisons. I have seen these pamphlets circulated in queer history circles before as excited evidence of Marie Antoinette's bisexuality, ignoring the reason they were written in the first place, not as a revelation or celebration of her actual sexuality, whatever it may be, but as a calculated political move to take advantage of the people's disgust at the idea that a woman, especially a powerful one, could love other women too. It's dangerous, unfortunately, to take many historical claims of a person's queerness at face value without interrogating the environment and motivations it was written in, and who they were. That said, although we have no concrete evidence of most of her relationships, as the writings on her relationships with women and the ones with men came out a number of decades after her death, and in fact many of her male relationships often were first spoken of even later than the female ones, meaning she was equally as likely to have loved women as men, there is absolutely nothing wrong with viewing her as a queer sapphic historical figure, because even based on the ways that she was talked about, in all likelihood she was. We have no reason to believe she wasn't, especially given the way that her relationships to women, in themselves for the most part, are not written in a necessarily defamatory manner, especially when speaking about her last girlfriend, Madame la Marquise de Florensac, also known as Marie-Louise Thérèse de Senneterre. Rather, that relationship is described by Louis de Rouvroy, le Duc de Saint-Simon, who lived during Julie's time and was her contemporary in the court of Versailles. For 2 years, they lived on this tenderness they thought ideal, ethereal, and beyond the reach of the stain of men. The young women isolated themselves, enamored, only appearing in public at occasions where their presence was essential. Indeed, one finds, after 1702, no songs or satire against the two women was written. This sweet description of the relationship by Saint-Simon is particularly interesting, since he's one of her actual contemporaries to write about her the earliest, and he hated her guts. Some of the earliest writings on Julie, though still appearing close to or after her death, come from 3 key figures in the French aristocracy who knew her personally, and all of whom despised her: Saint-Simon, Cardinal Guillaume Dubois, and Madame du Noyer. Okay, so as I got deeper into researching La Maupin, I knew the key to figuring out fact from fiction probably lies in following the paper trails back as far as possible, and it was not easy. This is incredibly difficult because obviously the best sources are going to be court and arrest records, death records, and descriptions of crimes. Sadly, I came up short finding any of those. I would likely need to go to France and spend days or months in dusty archives using my barely mediocre French skills to find what I'm looking for. So, in the absence of legal documents, the search shifted instead to the people talking about said crimes, who were alive when they happened. And the earliest voice in the game is a pretty infamous character named Madame Anne-Marguerite du Noyer. Now, Madame du Noyer is widely recognized as one of the first female journalists due to her prominent role in reporting on political conflicts. She ran away from her controlling husband with her daughters and made a career to support all of them by writing, well, hot juicy goss and selling it to anyone who would buy. Cardinal Dubois, who it seems had a low opinion of just about everyone except himself, describes her in his memoirs. This lady, who is no longer young or pretty or gallant, had abandoned France and her religion in order to have a pretext for leaving her husband, who kept her behind locked bars. Madame du Noyer had lived by her own industry in England and lived on that of her 2 daughters in Holland. The mother, in the pay of the booksellers, as she has long been in the pay of her lovers, gained her poor livelihood by concocting libels, and I should not have been spared if I had not gilded her pen. Cardinal Dubois ragging on du Noyer for constructing libels is laughable given the fact that most of his memoirs are straight-up lies, but he's not wrong either. In her own letters, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu complained to her friend about du Noyer's letters. 10,000 thanks to you for Madame du Noyer's letters. The stories are very extraordinary, but I know not whether she has not added a few éléments of invention to them. However, there is some truth. Say nothing of my malice. And in another, Mr. Resingate told me he would send you the 2 tomes of Madame du Noyer's memoirs. I fancy you will find yourself disappointed in them, for they are horribly grave and insipid, and instead of the gallantry you might expect, they are full of dull morals. Madame du Noyer, it seems, was an avid and very creative liar, with a lot of truth sprinkled in between. She even lied in many of her letters, many of which were published in 1705, and it is in one of her letters to a friend that the story of Julie stabbing herself on stage comes from. You see, Madame du Noyer hated Julie d'Aubigny, and although her writings don't mention her frequently, it is with considerable venom when they do, as you can see here in a very rough machine translation. This, of course, isn't to say that Julie didn't stab herself on stage. She was dramatic, after all, but Dunoyer may have had the motivation to add in some extra details or made-up context, who knows. Which is what makes the convent fire story so confusing. So far as I can tell, the earliest mention of this story actually comes from Madame Dunoyer, but her version of the tale doesn't mention Julie at all, and in fact is in many ways very different from the popular story we know today. She writes, "A nun who had become enamored of a gentleman who had whispered his love for her at the grill, resolved to scale the convent walls and rejoin the swain. Love, they say, burns fiercely beneath the nun's veil and the monk's habit. Thus did the nun make every attempt she could think of to gain her freedom. She told her lover of a plan, but he thought it would be very difficult to carry it out. Yet, whatever the obstacles, love, they say, will always find out a way." And now, what do you think our nun thought of? You shall hear. She told her lover to be next right at a certain spot, and all she wanted him to bring with him was a pair of good horses. She then left him in order to put her plan into execution, and I think you will agree it was a pretty bold one. That day there had been a funeral in the community. One of the sisters had been buried, and the grave had not yet been sealed. When all was quiet in the convent, she got into the place of the sepulchre, bore the dead nun to her cell, and then laid the corpse on her bed. Then she set fire to the cell. By means of a ladder which she had managed to obtain, and which she had contrived to drag up after her, she scaled the garden wall and flung herself into the arms of her lover, who was waiting for her burning with impatience. They lost no time in putting as much distance between themselves and the convent as they possibly could, and their journey was the happiest imaginable. When the alarm of fire was raised in the convent, all the nuns had hurried to the burning cell, and as the dead nun was attired in her habit and was already half consumed with flames, they never had the slightest doubt of who she was now the runaway was really the victim of the disaster. As soon as the lovers were beyond reach of pursuit, they duly entered into the bond of matrimony. The gentleman took up some sort of business career and amassed a lot of money. They had several children who would have been very rich if their mother's scruples had not exposed them to ruin by reason of the legal proceedings, which are now in question. The woman's husband died, and she was so grief-stricken at losing him that she also resolved to die to the world. She therefore withdrew to a convent, where remorse for the iniquities of her past life led her to make a confession which her children would have been better without. What the result of the litigation will be depends on the verdict of the Parliament of Toulouse. Okay, so in his 1930 book, Women in Men's Guise, Oscar Paul Gilbert comes to the conclusion that this story evolved into being about Julie d'Aubigny because the story actually was about her, and Madame Dunoyer was concealing her identity. Now, given what we know about Dunoyer and her hatred of Julie, plus that this was written in a letter to a friend, I have absolutely no idea why Dunoyer would care to protect Julie's name to this extent, even going so far as to change around the entire structure of the story. To me, personally, it seems much more likely that perhaps some true tale of Julie's life was mixed up with Dunoyer's story here, or if Dunoyer was recounting a true story from the news, then perhaps the people who seem to have attributed it to Julie first, Dubois and Saint-Simon, mixed Julie into the story either out of false memory or on purpose to smear her name. Both entirely possible, but without any original records of this convent fire, we'll never know. I sent emails to some officials in both Avignon and Forcalquier asking if they have any records, but have not heard back. So where does this story make its way to Julie d'Aubigny? Well, enter stage left, Cardinal Guillaume Dubois. Where do I even begin with this man? He was certainly a big personality with a lot of connections, but he had many enemies, not in the least the Duc de Saint-Simon himself. Saint-Simon apparently had a painting of the Cardinal Dubois on the wall of his bathroom, I assume to help him shit faster. He describes Dubois as a little pitiful, wizened, herring-gutted man in a flaxen wig with a weasel's face, brightened by some intellect. All the vices, perfidy, avarice, debauchery, ambition, flattery, fought within him for the mastery. He was so consummate a liar that, when taken in the fact, he could brazenly deny it. Even his wit and knowledge of the world were spoiled, and his affected gaiety was touched with sadness by the odor of falsehood which escaped through every pore of his body. which is brutal. Now, just like Dunoyer, Dubois had a habit of making his stories basically whatever he wanted them to be, whatever sounded most interesting. Even the introduction to his memoirs needs to make this clear. The evidence of recent research tends rather to regard the work as apocryphal. The Comte de Céliac, in his L'Abbé de Bois, published in 1862, one of the most important works in the life of the cardinal, disregards the memoirs altogether. M.C.H. Abertin, in his interesting L'Esprit public au 18 siècle, whoa, my 2 years of French class are not coming in clutch right now. Published in 1873, comes to the conclusion that they are probably spurious, while M. Carrard, in his Les Supercheries littéraires de Voyer, 1869, decides they were composed by the above-mentioned Paul Lecroix and founded on a certain Vie privée du Cardinal de Bois, published in London in 1789. These memoirs, published for the first time in 1829, but apparently written in the 1720s, have a lot to say about Julie d'Aubigny. Dubois claims that d'Aubigny was constantly threatening to kill him, but his memories of her are valuable in a different way. They offer yet another explanation for the convent fire story. Dubois actually claims the story came to him directly from Duménil's lips. Duménil, the lecherous, drunken opera singer that she mugged, yet another person who famously hated Julie and notoriously wanted to take her down. The Maupin's sorriest defect, in my opinion, was her passion for her own sex. Duménil, an actor of the opera, having seen the failure of his amorous projects with La Maupin, as a scheme of vengeance, planned to cause a quarrel between her and the Duc de Chartres. He had made my acquaintance since my habit of going behind the scenes. He sought me out, and the resentment I felt against the Maupin incited me to second him. He related to me, among other exploits of this young lady, an incident which might have landed her in a prison, perhaps even further. When she was a member of the Opera Company of Marseille, she became tenderly attached to a young person who was relegated by her family to a convent at Avignon. She was wrath at the separation, and contrived to be accepted as a novice in the same convent. There she consecrated herself to the service of her mistress rather than of God. But, tired of the restraint to which both had to submit, the two friends formed a plan of escape, which was more fortunate than prudent. A nun died and was buried. Maupin, during the night, exhumed the body, carried it into the cell of her accomplice, and escaped with her thanks to the outbreak of a fire. They took refuge in Germany and let themselves be tried and found guilty in default. Maupin was condemned to be burned, but 10 years having passed, she owed her impunity to the forgetfulness of justice and the protection of her lovers. I retailed this adventure in the Palais Royal, and seasoned it with 1,000 witticisms which were not to the honor of the Maupin. He then goes on to suggest that the incident where Julie accosted Duménil was due to the story of him spreading rumors about her starting a fire at a convent to run off with a nun. Based on what we can gather about Duménil, this doesn't seem too far-fetched. But even from this story, it's hard to say for certain that this means an incident involving Julie never happened. The cardinal also details the story of Julie going to the ball dressed in men's clothing, kissing a Mademoiselle de Maupin, and then fighting 3 men and beating them, a story which escalates every new time it is told. We'll come back to that. First, we need to circle back to our friend, the Duc de Saint-Simon, who had his own memoirs to account for. Saint-Simon's memoirs were written around the 1740s, but not published until 1829, the same year as Dubois, and somehow it's even more aggressive towards Julie than Dubois was, and his retelling of the convent story takes a decidedly sharp turn into portraying Julie as even more of a villain. It places her and the young woman as eloping in the night and hiding in the convent to escape the girl's pursuing family. He says that this girl was afraid of Julie and did not love her, and so was essentially being held captive. Then he makes an even more extreme accusation. Interrupted in her designs and irritated by opposition, this theatrical miscreant and set fire at midnight to the building that had so hospitably sheltered her, and in the general confusion, secured her unhappy victim and fled to a sequestered village where they were concealed for several weeks. But the country being alarmed at such a flagrant enormity, a diligent search took place, the offender was traced to her retreat, and seized after a long resistance, in which she killed one of the officers of justice and dangerously wounded 2 others. In a crowded theater, conceiving herself affronted by Dumesnil, a favorite actor, remarkable for mild temper and inoffensive manners, she rushed up on stage, poured forth a torrent of abuse on the unlucky fellow, interrupted the entertainment, and actually caned him before all the audience. At a ball given by the Prince of the Blood, La Maupin, insolently parading the room in men's clothes, and treating a lady of distinction very indecently, was called out at different times by 3 gentlemen, each of whom she ran through the body. So Saint-Simon appears to be one of, if not the first people to actually accuse Julie of murder. If she actually murdered and publicly beat people like this, I highly doubt Madame de Maupin and Cardinal de Bois would have sat out on the chance to talk about it. Not only that, but the duels at the ball story doesn't sit right with me given the culture of French dueling at the time. You didn't just challenge someone to duel and then go outside and duke it out. It was very organized and typically involved setting a scheduled date and time and would not have been 3-on-1. And as strong as her connections may have been, it's extremely unlikely that she would have been protected from the law if she really was out there killing aristocrats in public, or even officers of the law. To date, no one has ever found any proof that Julie ever killed anyone. It's almost certain she fought people, sure, but Julie d'Aubigny was not a murderer. Even though the Dubois and Saint-Simon memoirs were written in the 1720s to 40s, they weren't published until the 1800s. But clearly people were already talking about Julie and these stories long before then, loudly enough that she was being reported on in British newspapers by the 1780s. Why? Well, the answer comes back to those anecdote collections and dictionaries that I brought up earlier. The most famous early ones being the 2 written by the Parfait brothers, the Dictionnaire des Théâtres de Paris from 1769, and the Anecdotes Dramatiques from 1775. Interestingly enough, the Dictionnaire actually talks about Julie in very mild terms, but does mention that she has a lot of wild stories about her that they admit are only half true, so they don't want to report on it. Then, in the 8 years later, they give in and they do report the juicy stories in Anecdotes Dramatiques because, well, it's a book called Dramatic Anecdotes and that's what people want to hear. It's obvious that these stories about Julie were circulating widely for decades after her death. The Parfait brothers reportedly got these stories from a memoir written by Julie herself, but the memoir, if it even really existed, has been lost to time. The issue is that a lot of early print media and documents just weren't made to last. What has survived till today has done so out of immense protection or completely by luck or accident. France, in particular, experienced so many political and social upheavals and wars in the last 300 years that it's a miracle that anything survived at all. So it's no wonder that as time went on and proof of facts became harder and harder to find, people seeking to tell La Maupin's story had no choice but to rely on previous second or third or fourth-hand accounts, and sometimes they took it even further. Julie's story circulated over and over for decades, eventually inspiring the romantic novelist Théophile Gautier to write Mademoiselle de Maupin in the 1830s, a story which is based only very, very loosely on Julie, and yet heavily influenced later generations' image of her. The novel inspired even more encyclopedia, dictionary, and anecdote collection writers to take on her story, and with each retelling, the details changed more and more. In 1910, friend of the channel Bram Stoker got in on the action with his book Famous Impostors. Much like Saint-Simon, Stoker has a decidedly negative view of Julie, and fancies her a serial killer. In fact, his version of the convent tale, the caning of the Dumesnil incident, and more all look to be pulled directly from Saint-Simon's version point for point. He's got such an attitude about it too, but I guess I can't judge him because I'm also having an attitude about this whole thing. He is definitely haunting me though, and I'd wish he'd stop. So, obviously, 1,000,001 different publications have all taken on Julie's story, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but the next most prominent ones are Gallant Ladies by Cameron Rogers, published in 1928, and Women and Men's Guides by Oscar Paul Gilbert, published in 1932. Now, Cameron Rogers and Oscar Paul Gilbert both published some of the longest, most elaborated takes on Julie that we have, and injected some random dialogue that appears to have been completely made up. Rogers actually takes pains to ignore her attraction to women and relationships with them, and leans into the rumor that the Comte d'Albert was the love of her life, which of course may be true, but the evidence is extremely fishy. I will say though that I'm loving the fact that in Rogers' version of the Julie mugging Dumesnil story, he adds in an "and then everybody clapped" trope. Gilbert, on the other hand, has some truly bizarre takes. As I mentioned earlier, he is of the opinion that Madame de Noailles' story was about Julie, and she was trying to protect Julie's name. Gilbert also garnishes the story heavily, with details that absolutely no one could have possibly known, and paints 14-year-old Julie as a seductress who fought for D'Armagnac's affections. A 49-year-old man. Boo, Gilbert, your antics are nasty, disgusting. Ironically though, despite the fact that Gilbert also falls into the idea that the Comte d'Albert was Julie's great singular romance, he also is one of the only ones to give any significant space to Madame de Florensac. He brings up one telling quote from the Parfait brothers. La Maupin's retirement was occasioned by the death of Madame la Comtesse de Florensac, who honored Mademoiselle de Maupin with her friendship and her protection. Mademoiselle Maupin, after bitterly grieving for this lady's death, asked to be released from her engagements and retired to some sequestered and distant retreat. He claims that Florensac's young death of a fever compelled Julie in her grief to turn to religion and give up her career for a hermit-like life in a convent where she died 2 years later. He claims, with basically no sources, that she was tormented by mystical hallucinations and died in a suburb of Paris where her body was cast upon the rubbish heap. A claim that I have not seen anywhere else and seems particularly cruel. At least many of the others who handled her story admitted that we don't know how she died, or where, or at least had her reconcile with her weenie husband. But Gilbert furnished her story with a swath of other, seemingly random new details. I expect an unknown ending was just not spicy enough for him. As if Julie's beautiful lover dying young after they both finally found happiness is not punishment enough for La Maupin. I mean, perhaps that's the thing though. Innumerable writers, whether or not they knew her personally, have tried to posthumously punish Julie d'Aubigny by turning her into something she wasn't, for the crime of being sapphic, gender nonconforming, and truthfully very aggressive. Too much so for her own good, in a time where those were things a woman shouldn't be. I've spent a lot of time in this video picking at these stories, maybe in a way that makes it look like I'm trying to disprove the parts of her that makes her such a cool and enticing historical figure to us today. But it's not her queerness or even her temper that was suspect to me. I mean, look at my Caravaggio video. If a historical figure is queer and an asshole, it is what it is, and I'll tell you about it. But Julie d'Aubigny is an interesting case. She has become a queer icon not in spite of or ignorance of the bad things she supposedly did, but because of them. It's girl bossification in action, I suppose. People hear that she killed a bunch of dudes, and that sounds pretty cool because we love to see badass women in history, and she reminds us of a Game of Thrones character or something. But Julie d'Aubigny was a real person, and from what we can glean from certain accounts of her, these rumors, which were fairly mild in her time, made her upset enough to mug a guy or send death threats to a powerful cardinal, allegedly. I'm not saying she was tame and all of these stories are complete lies. I'm saying she's worth a closer look than what may very well be homophobically charged libel about her written or spread by people who openly hated her. I mean, Cardinal Dubois literally admitted that he lied about her to make her look bad. How many other people did and just didn't admit it? Unfortunately, we'll never know, because we have no input from Julie herself to cut through the noise. The thing is, though, that because we can't say 100% sure which stories are completely untrue or not, who Julie d'Aubigny really is up to you, I guess. You get to decide what you believe, and to an extent, none of us are more correct than the others. I've given you my personal opinion, and you're totally free to disagree with me. Based on what I've read and deduced, based on what I know about French society at the time, I think that Julie d'Aubigny was exactly what most of us can agree on. A sapphic, hot-tempered, sword-fighting opera singer who loved to wear men's clothes, loved to flirt with people, and stood up for whatever she believed that justice was. I think there's a lot there worthy of admiration. I don't think she ever murdered anyone, but a brawl or two adds some spice to life. And until we get some hard evidence, I don't think she burned down a convent. I don't think she fought off 3 dudes at once at a royal ball, much less killed them, but I think it's very believable that she would have shown up in men's clothes and kissed a woman in front of everyone, maybe even asked for a duel. I don't know if I believe she publicly caned Dumesnil on stage, but if she did, I think she was justified. And lastly, I think the best evidence in support of her great love for Madame de Florensac is the fact that so many writers were too scared to talk about it. But if the grief of La Maupin was boundless after Florensac's death, enough for her to retire in her 30s and uncharacteristically enter a life of solitude and die, in a convent no less, when only a decade prior the religious life had been so distasteful to her, what else but love could it be? Julie d'Aubigny, for all of her simultaneous explosive life details and ambiguity, as a result becomes a character that is what you want her to be. Writers who hated the homosexual aspect of her life either used it to demonize her or completely ignored it in favor of expanding on or inventing her male love interests. Writers who hated her talents and belief in outspokenly standing up for herself and other women used it as an excuse to accuse her of numerous violent crimes that we'll maybe never know were true or not. And now, in the age of the internet, Julie d'Aubigny has been transformed into a memeable history girly that is easy to use as punchy content. Hashtag girlboss, hashtag pussyhat, hashtag badbitch. Whoever she truly was, we'll never know, but the fact that she existed at all and wreaked so much havoc on the psyches of the pompous Versailles aristocracy, well, I guess that really is worthy of a legend or two. Thank you for exploring the legacy of Julie d'Aubigny with me. I'm sorry that maybe this video was a bit boring because a lot of it is me going over sources, so I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Massive thanks to Kelly Gardner for their immensely helpful blog and many years of research on Julie and for kindly answering a couple of my questions. Thank you to Jim Burrows for his very old but still incredibly helpful website on La Maupin. And thank you as well to the BBC's You're Dead to Me podcast recent episode on Julie, which I have linked below. It is so well done and very much worth the listen. Be sure to take advantage of Atlas VPN's huge discount by getting a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the description below. Anyway, I'll see you next month for a couple videos that take us forward in time to the Edwardian era. So until then, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and keep your enemies close, but your swords even closer.